the role of the chaplain in the military. I mean, we live in a society that has separation of church and state. Right? So someone might ask, well then how is it that there's religious clergy? There are chaplains, religious chaplains in the US military, which is clearly a government institution. Our salaries were paid by, or my salary was paid by US tax dollars. Well, the role of the chaplain, as I mentioned, is to defend religious freedom based on the First Amendment right found in our Constitution. Religious freedom. And as I indicated, our job as chaplains was to defend or to provide religious accommodations to those who serve the military, those who may work on a military installation, or even a prisoner who may be incarcerated. When we look at our own history in this nation, we find the first people to settle here coming from Europe came for a reason. The Pilgrims, when they landed on Plymouth Rock, they were looking for religious freedom. They wanted a place where they could worship in the manner that they so choose. Even if they had their own puritanical views and doctrine, they wanted a place where they could freely worship in the way that they wanted. So perhaps the very first cause in our nation was that of religious freedom. And of course, embodied in our Constitution. In Guantanamo Bay, that was not the case. The 660 or so prisoners that were there when I was assigned to this prison camp were all Muslim. Each prisoner was a person of the Muslim faith. And they all endured religious persecution. Let me just give you 3 quick examples of how. And this was done systematically. The personnel in Guantanamo, especially in the intelligence operation, clearly understood aspects of Islam. And in my view as a chaplain, what I viewed there was the use of religion as a weapon. The use of religion as a weapon. Because all the prisoners were Muslim, it was essentially the use of Islam against these Muslim prisoners. One way in which that was done was using the Holy Quran. The Holy Quran in Muslim tradition is considered to be the literal words of God. If you went into a Muslim home, you find the Quran put on the highest shelf. Okay? It's never placed anywhere that's dirty or filthy. It's never brought into the restroom. A Muslim student would never even place the Quran under his or her desk or chair, because then you would be sitting over the Quran and that would be considered disrespectful to the words of God. And in our sister religion, in our sister faith of Judaism, you find a similar respect towards what's considered to be God's word. When you go into a Jewish synagogue, you find the scriptures in the front of the facility stored in what's known as the Ark. Many times it's under lock and key. And this is done out of respect, reverence for what's considered to be God's word. In Guantanamo Bay, people understood, US personnel understood how Muslims all over the world revere and respect the Quran. In May of 2005, we heard a news report from Newsweek magazine that indicated that US personnel in Guantanamo were desecrating the Holy Quran. This news was actually very old. This had actually occurred when I was in Guantanamo, and the problems revolving around the Holy Quran, the Muslim book of worship, being desecrated in Guantanamo was happening when I was there. I can confirm that that actually indeed happened. Whether it was guards who, when they searched the cells of the prisoners, and of course in every prison operation there's a need for proper security and security procedures, but when they searched the Qurans, they were mishandled, they were handled roughly, bindings, the text, sometimes cracked, ripped, torn by the guards, and recklessly tossed on the ground during these searches. Because the prisoners at that time were living in these open-air cell-like cages, they could observe how the guards would conduct their searches. And when the Qurans were tossed on the floor, on the grounds, they became furious. American Muslim personnel were upset that the Holy Quran was being mistreated. Things got worse. Qurans were then eventually taken into the interrogation room by interrogators. And they would throw the Quran on the floor in front of the shackled prisoner to try and elicit some response, thinking that may help that interrogator gain information from this prisoner. They would step on it, they would kick on it, they would sit on it. Reports into abuses of the Holy Quran in Guantanamo, or an investigation was later conducted into abuses of the Quran in Guantanamo, and it revealed that even at times, US personnel urinated on the Quran. This was done because Muslim personnel indeed understood how Muslims around the world, Muslims in the prison, respected the words of God, and they tried to use that to pressure prisoners to give information, or to even just to humiliate them. That was just one particular way in which I felt religion was being used as a weapon. Another way was exploiting another aspect of Muslim culture. In this room here today, we see a mixed gender audience, men and women sitting together, okay, and that's our culture. But in the Muslim world, in some of the more orthodox or more conservative Islamic societies, you find something different. You find separation of the sexes. You find a certain etiquette where men and women separate. If you go to Islamic Center, even here in the United States, you find a place for women to pray and you find a place for men to pray. In some Muslim communities, you find very limited handshaking between men and women, because a Muslim woman may feel offended if her husband would shake the hand physically of another woman. She feels that her husband is hers, not to be touched by any other woman. Right? That aspect of Muslim culture was exploited in Guantanamo as well. It was well understood. There was a very competitive interrogation process. There was an enormous amount of pressure coming from then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld to get information, to get intelligence from these captives in Guantanamo, and as such there was an enormous pressure on this intelligence operation. So it was very competitive. Who can get the most information? There were both males and females in this interrogation operation. But the female interrogators perhaps felt maybe they had a slight advantage over their male counterparts because of this aspect of Muslim culture. Many of the young men held in Guantanamo never having been very close physically or exposed to women in their lives. Women interrogators took advantage of this. Some of them were very crassly ready to strip off their own clothes, stand naked in front of a Muslim male prisoner, thinking she could use that tactic to get information from prisoners. They would go further. They would inappropriately rub their own bodies on these shackled male prisoners as they sat in their chairs, not being able to resist. It's suggested in other investigations, military investigations into abuses at Guantanamo, that female prisoners even went as far as grabbing the genitals of male prisoners in Guantanamo in the course of them being interrogated. This, in my view, was humiliating, to be subjected to this type of sexual humiliation by female interrogators in Guantanamo. But it was quite understood that this was done in exploitation of certain aspects of Muslim culture to try and use that against these prisoners in order to try and help them gain information. One other way which I'll describe that was occurring in Guantanamo was something that was first described to me by a prisoner in a complaint to me, and then later actually confirmed by some of the American translators who worked within the intelligence operation. Most of the translators in Guantanamo were American Muslims. They were those who were part of my congregation in Guantanamo. I held the weekly Friday worship service for Muslim personnel. That was held for US Muslim personnel. Prisoners were confined to their cells, could not attend congregational worship. But a prisoner would describe for me in a complaint to me that he was taken to an interrogation room. An interrogation room was merely a room, an empty room with a chair. And they had a D-ring on the ground where prisoners were often short-shackled during interrogation. But this one particular interrogation room had marked a symbol in this room, on the floor. And it was a large circle around this chair, or actually it's a large circle in the middle of this interrogation room. And in the center of this circle was another marking, it was another symbol. Some might even call it a religious symbol. It was a pentagram star-shaped symbol that is used to represent Satan, the satanic symbol. If you go online and Google in images, satanic symbols, you find this pentagram-type star that represents Satan. It was marked in the center of this satanic circle on the floor. Interrogators would take a prisoner, knowing that the core belief of Islam is to believe in one God. And they would take a Muslim prisoner, force him in the center of this circle, this satanic circle, and attempt to force him to bow down, to pray in the form of the Muslim prayer. Maybe when you've seen a Muslim pray, we bow down, we prostrate, we put our forehead on the ground in honor of that one God. They attempted to force Muslims in Guantanamo to prostrate in the center of this satanic circle while they would scream at these prisoners that Satan is your God now. Not Allah, meaning God the Almighty, God the Creator, God who rules all things. Right? That was being done in Guantanamo. Individuals in Guantanamo, prisoners in Guantanamo were being persecuted for their faith. There were other things that were happening in Guantanamo, from beards being forcibly shaven. It was understood that many religious Muslims feel wearing a beard is an obligation upon a faithful Muslim. Sometimes they were forcefully shaven by the command at Guantanamo. There was something I learned later, after I was long gone from Guantanamo, that I read in the media that I wasn't even aware of that had occurred. This was when I read how interrogators during an interrogation session would maybe dress themselves up posing as a Catholic priest. And they would come into an interrogation room. It would be an interrogator who this prisoner had never seen before, but he would be robed as a Catholic priest. And then he would come in front of this shackled prisoner, forcefully baptize him, which would be an indication, according to this fake priest, that this person had now been baptized into the Christian religion, no longer Muslim. That was done to humiliate and see if that would pressure prisoners in Guantanamo to give some information, or even give a confession. But in actuality, I feel, and though I wasn't part of the intelligence operation, or was never trained formally as an intelligence officer, it was quite clear to me that these types of tactics did not help interrogation process. Prisoners responded by rioting, by causing chaos in the cell blocks, by refusing to talk to interrogators, because they merely felt that they were being humiliated because they were Muslim. In my view as a chaplain, whose first and foremost role was to render religious accommodations, to protect religious freedoms, I felt that these types of tactics were against American values. And that's when I began expressing my concerns over what was happening. I didn't have any direct influence with the commander of the intelligence operation, but indeed I could relay these things to my command on the detention side of the operation. But this is how I saw religion being used as a weapon. There were other aspects of abuse that included physical type beatings and things like that I'm aware that occurred in the intelligence interrogation sessions. And even though I didn't witness those things, I did at times see some of the consequences, the bruises on some of the prisoners, the broken teeth every now and then, or whatnot. And I saw that on prisoners in their cells. You heard in the Mass when I talked a little bit about what would happen to me for raising concerns, raising objections to the mistreatment of prisoners. I myself didn't endure anywhere near the punishment that prisoners in Guantanamo receive. Although some of the ways in which I was treated, being subjected to the sensory deprivation, is no doubt somewhat torturous, because you don't know what's happening. I recognized very quickly that I was being treated like prisoners in Guantanamo, and that could mean that all of my rights, even as a US citizen, may be at that very moment stripped from me. It was known that President Bush had declared that Geneva Conventions did not apply in Guantanamo, and therefore did not have rights down in Guantanamo. But essentially, that's some of how prisoners were treated. That's what has gone on inside Guantanamo. And most of what I talk about is now really in the public domain. And much of the abuse that has occurred is documented. Even the memos that led up to authorizing certain interrogation techniques now are in the public domain and clearly documented. And this is what I speak out against, in hopes that our nation will never go back to something like that. We have seen in our country this idea that history does tend to repeat itself. We've seen other groups oppressed and humiliated in our country. But I hope that as we grow as a nation, that we get better, that we improve, and that in raising our voice, raising my voice against these types of things, that this one particular black mark of Guantanamo Bay, which is now stained on the history of our country, that we can somehow overcome that somewhere in the future and return that to that status where we are looked at in the world as leaders of human rights, leaders of the rule of law. Today, the world has a much, much different opinion of the United States, and as someone who loves this country, who loves where I was born and raised, I want the society and the country that I live in to be the best that it can be possibly be. I mean, that was the motto that was held by the US Army when I entered it. Be all you can be. And I still strive with that motto. I'd love to open the floor to any questions or comments that people may have of me as an American Muslim, as former military chaplain, as an officer, graduate of West Point. I'm open to any question that you may have. Let's start in the way back.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you're aware of the Military Religious Freedom Foundation's work. And this guy, Weinstein,
Mikey
who
Weinstein,
was an Air Force Academy grad, has identified all these instances. Of course, yours are terrible instances that were used on prisoners. And he's actually found many of these things being used on our own troops to proselytize and make this kind of into this religious crusade that they think, whatever. I'm glad you know about him, because it's great work he's done. He's filed a lot of lawsuits trying to end this type of thing.
yes. Mikey Weinstein is a former military JAG officer of the US Air Force. He's also a graduate of the United States Air Force Academy. His 3 children have all graduated from the United States Air Force Academy. And he's on a crusade himself, and that is to ensure that pluralism, the aspect of pluralism, religious freedom, is upheld within our US military. And I've talked to him several times. I'm on his email list. He sends me a lot of information about some of the work that he's doing, and he's doing a great job in uncovering a lot of the discrimination of even Christians within the US military. But he supports those who are Muslim, Hindu, Jewish, non-practicing atheists who may be in the military. And he's doing a great amount of work, even bringing lawsuits against the government to ensure that people's religious freedom is upheld within our military system. He himself had, in the past, started, I guess, his work by first filing a civil lawsuit against the U.S. government for discrimination against his son, who was a cadet at the Air Force Academy, being discriminated against when he was Jewish. That case would later be thrown out after his son had graduated, and the ruling would be that his son is no longer a cadet at the academy, so there's no longer reason to rule on this case. But he has taken further steps to really advocate for pluralism within the U.S. military. Military Religious Freedom Foundation, for anyone who would like to research that organization more. MRFF. Okay. Question on this side, anyone? Right here in front.
Yeah. Before Guantanamo, do you have a historical sense of when these abuses of prisoners started? Was it strictly because of the creation of the prison at Guantanamo that the policies came into play at that point in time, or was this something that had started before that?
The abuse of prisoners, in my view, has actually occurred in our nation for a long time, even on U.S. soil and U.S. prisons. We have abuse of prisoners that happens today. But with regard to Guantanamo, the policies that were enacted by the administration at that time, in my view, came as a result of 9/11 and the authorizing of these harsh interrogation tactics opened the doors to torture. Guantanamo Bay itself was placed in a location where the U.S. government thought at the time that because it was not on U.S. soil, prisoners would not have rights, prisoners would not have legal protections, and that essentially anything could be done. When President Bush declared the Geneva Conventions did not apply, that was essentially saying that the gloves were off. Right? And these were comments that were essentially made by officials within the administration. But one of the stark similarities that I saw with the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, the prison in Iraq where the photos of nudity and humiliation of prisoners was exposed in 2004. If you go to the history of our country and look at the photos that come from the prison in upstate New York known as Attica prison, you find almost exactly this type of treatment that people received in Abu Ghraib with regard to nudity. You see all the prisoners lined up naked when they tried to quell this riot, and the guards came in. There's a famous story of this one prisoner. His name was actually, big black, large African-American male prisoner who they tried to characterize as being one of the ringleaders of the riots. When the guards got in, he was placed on a large wooden table, stripped naked, and they would put a football under his chin. And they said if this football rolled off, they would cut off his testicles. This is the type of treatment he was subjected to. But in terms of the pictures, and you see all the individuals lined up, standing naked, it reminded me of what was the photos that were exposed in Abu Ghraib. So prison abuse has occurred here at home, and it's an issue that also can be taken up by human rights activists. Yes.
What is the attitude of the Muslim American or military Muslim community on the just cause issue of why we went to war in Iraq, and does that affect? I mean, is that why there's so much this brainwashing? And I mean, is that do you feel, I guess, as a Muslim in our country, do you feel that's the reason where it came to this point where honestly, you know, I mean, some people are saying Donald Rumsfeld and a few others should be treated as war criminals. I mean, and I'm one of them.
Yeah, that question of what do American Muslims feel about this just cause issue really is appropriately asked of American Muslims, not those within the military.
Well, right.
Within the military, as a soldier, as a military member, you really don't have a say as to what you do. You follow the orders of your command. It's the president who decides, you know, when and how to go to war. yet you are still able to have your own individual opinion. Myself personally, the current conflicts that we see today in Iraq and in Afghanistan, I'm completely against. The invading Iraq, of course, we know there was never any weapons of mass destruction. There is so much information out there that suggests that that we just wanted to carry out a regime change. And the Iraqi army was essentially destroyed after the first Gulf War. So they were not a legitimate threat to any country, in my view. One of the reasons why I believe this is because as Iraq borders Israel, the country of Israel, if Iraq was a legitimate threat, Israel would have already taken military steps without consideration from the United States to protect themselves. And there was no military action from Israel. That to me was an indication that Iraq did not pose a threat to that nation. In the past, they had taken their own steps and bombed certain sites which they believed were possibly building weapons of mass destruction that could be used against Israel. So those steps were never taken by that country, and in my view, Iraq in no way posed a national security threat to the United States. The same with Afghanistan. Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the world. I wholeheartedly actually disagreed with President Obama's move to escalate Afghanistan and send 30,000 more troops to the region. But one of the things I recently read in the media is they've now learned that Afghanistan has a treasure of untapped minerals and natural resources, right? Perhaps that might have been a motivation. Perhaps that information was known not to the public but to others as a reason why we may be surging in Afghanistan. But the Taliban, I don't see in any way the Taliban, as much as I may disagree with how they implement their own society or even practice Islam, do not see them as a national security threat to the United States. The Taliban was a group that was actually in correspondence with our government prior to 9/11. We had brought members of the Taliban to the White House to dialogue about possible relations. So I myself, as a Muslim American, am wholeheartedly against these conflicts, and pretty much so is the rest of the Muslim world. The George Bush I father had a coalition of forces in the first Gulf War, which included many Muslim nations. And the atmosphere, having served during that time, was very different than the atmosphere we find today in this current Iraqi conflict. The George Bush son didn't have the coalition of the willing. Not one Muslim nation participated in this current conflict against Iraq. And as such, I saw a hostility towards Islam and Muslims like you didn't see in the first Gulf War. During the first Gulf War, you had some ignorance, lack of knowledge, some people who may have individual biases against Islam and Muslims. But essentially, you had other Muslims fighting alongside American troops from other nations. Muslims from other nations fighting alongside American troops. And it's even been reported that maybe 5,000 to 7,000 of American GIs actually converted to Islam as a result of having been deployed to the Gulf and learning about Islam. So you had a very different atmosphere. The very first time as a Muslim, a very young new Muslim convert, when I was deployed to Saudi Arabia in the aftermath of the first Gulf War, I was allowed by my command to go and visit Mecca on a pilgrimage as a deployed US soldier, escorted by Saudi military personnel to visit the holy city. And this was offered to any American Muslim serving in the region during that time. But in this current conflict today, I saw a very different atmosphere, different attitude, more hostility towards Islam and Muslims. And no doubt there was hostility towards Islam and Muslims down in Guantanamo, not only towards the prisoners, but also directed towards the American Muslim community that were down there also being patriots, serving their country in this manner. Although the operation itself was very harmful, very abusive. Those who were serving in the military were serving because of their patriotic duty. But American Muslims in Guantanamo felt also that hostility. On the way back, sir? Yep.
I wonder, your arrest was a really visible action that was taken.
Yes.
And I have kind of a two-part question of, at what level do you think that was approved, or there was knowledge of that, and then what was the message they were trying to send with your arrest?
Great question. Based on the first immediate report of my arrest, which was, the story was broke by the Washington Times. Washington Times, if you follow the media, is a very conservative, Pentagon-friendly publication. The Washington Times reported that when I was arrested, the decision to arrest me was made at the, quote, highest levels of our government, without stating what the highest, where that was. But to me, the highest level of our government is the president himself. I believe that it went all the way up the chain of command, that there was information regarding how I was treated, how I was arrested, all the way up. One of the interesting things happened to me when I was in prison, when I first got a visit from a civilian attorney who I would later retain, a military law expert, who I later found was himself was very well connected, very respected as a legal professional. When he met me in the prison, in the brig in Charleston, South Carolina, he informed me, and I don't know what his sources were, but he had told me that my name was mentioned in that day's presidential intelligence report. Again, I don't know his sources, but I do know he is a very well-connected individual. Something else that struck me as kind of odd was later a public release or press release was made by Rumsfeld's office, and it was that the Yee case never made it to the desk of the Secretary of Defense, and I don't believe that for a moment. Throughout my case, the commander of Guantanamo Bay, Major General Jeffrey Miller, who is now known to have gone from Guantanamo to Abu Ghraib in order to, quote, Gitmoize the Iraqi prison, he would later accept responsibility for three things: my arrest, my imprisonment, and the decision to bring charges against me. But in the whole spectrum of things, I think he is a very low, even though he was a two-star general, is a very low-level person in the aspect of my case.
The part about what message would that send?
What message was being sent? I think the message being sent to me was pretty much they were retaliating against me for raising concerns about abuses inside this prison camp. Again, this is late 2003. The extent of abuse that has occurred in Guantanamo today is not fully known, but the massive amount of information that we do have today was not known at that time. The only thing the public actually knew about Guantanamo in terms of treatment were the pictures that were released by the Pentagon when prisoners arrived into Guantanamo, how they were sensory deprived and kneeling and forced shackled, in pictures that were released by the Pentagon, and also in some other photos that were taken by service members when prisoners were transported. They showed prisoners being hooded and strapped in the military cargo planes. With regard to how prisoners were being treated inside the prison camp, the American people at that time, all of you were pretty much, had no information. I was there on the ground, was raising concerns about specific things. I believe this was in a large part due to retaliate against me in that manner. Okay. On this side,
Thank you.
Say, the abuses you cite are truly atrocious and reprehensible, but do you think that the Muslim community bears any weight of blame here? I mean, a lot of people are upset at the kind of implacable violence and threats to cartoonists who write things they don't like, or Rushdie, and the lack of response by Muslim leaders to that kind of violence. And
Yeah, let me address a couple of things here. And one is, Islam does not in any way condone violence or attacking, killing, or taking the lives of innocent civilians, period. One of the ideas that is very much perpetrated by media talking heads, people who have an agenda against Islam, is that this is a religion that encourages violence. Right? Islam, the word Islam, and the greeting that Muslims use, Assalamu alaikum. The word salam actually means peace, right? And submission to God, because when you submit yourself to God, ultimately you'll find inner peace. The other point that you mentioned about not about violence, you mentioned not cartoons, the second aspect.
Rushdie? Solomon Rushdie?
No, you mentioned the second aspect I wanted to address. That Muslim community, American Muslim leaders have been silent on this. That is another fallacy that is also perpetrated, especially by media talking heads. If you go to any major American Muslim organization website, you find on their website a religious fatwa. We call it a fatwa, a religious ruling by the highest scholars within the faith that condemn terrorism. Right? Council on American Islamic Relations, Islamic Society of North America, the Islamic Circle of North America, the Muslim American Society, the Muslim Political Impact, Muslim, I believe it's Muslim, I don't know, but they're another major organization, Impact. All have on their websites and all have spoken out in the media against terrorism, against violence, against innocent people. One of the things that I saw in the media was an interview done, I believe it was, what show was this? I want to say it was Glenn Beck, but I don't think it was Glenn Beck. It was, no, it wasn't Rush.
O'Reilly?
No, it wasn't O'Reilly, some of the more conservative ones. Hannity, who else? Coulter, no. I can't remember. I'm trying to remember because I remember the spokesperson. The spokesperson was from the Council on American Islamic Relations, and was on the show, and the host said, how come the American Muslim community, American Muslim leaders don't speak out against this? He's talking about violence and radicalism, stuff like that. And the response by the individual was, I'm trying to remember because he used his first name when he responded back. I don't remember him saying Sean, I don't remember saying, but he said, look, you've had me on the show before, and I've spoken out against this. Why are you asking me or trying to reiterate this idea that we're not speaking out? I've been on your show in the past and have spoken out on terrorism, on violence and whatnot, but yet here you are asking me, why isn't the American Muslim leadership speaking out against this? You know, so it was like an idea that he was trying to get out that this is reality, but but essentially it is not reality. And if you go to, like I said, any major American Muslim organization, we're doing everything we can in order to voice our objections to this type of violence, this type of action, and whatnot. One of the things, though, that also may be a challenge is getting the Muslim voice heard, getting our voice heard on the airwaves. perhaps we are, as a community, very ineffective in general in addressing the media and in getting our voices out there, and not proactive enough to get our message into the airwaves. But that could also be part of it.
I would like to suggest that the media has its own agenda, and you have trouble getting there. Peace community has a lot of trouble
Yes.
getting there. And when we have peace events in this city, if we have any mention at all of the event, it's usually on page 9 at the bottom of the page.
Yes.
So it's not unusual that your voice isn't heard. It's because they don't want to hear your voice.
Yeah.
They have their agenda, which is the corporate agenda, which makes money off the war.
Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned a little earlier that this kind of activity has been going on for
Prison abuse.
probably centuries, but do you think that the activity that was exposed, that you helped expose, is continuing someplace? Has it just gone deeper underground and it's still happening? Or have enough exposure done which will cause the chain of command to
Is abuse at Guantanamo still happening? Well, Guantanamo Bay is still open. President Obama, on the second day of taking presidency, actually promised to close the facility by January 22nd of 2010. That date is long gone, but Guantanamo is still up and running, right? But is abuse still happening in Guantanamo? And some of the things, much of what was happening when I was there, I believe, does not occur anymore. But there's still, in my view, abuse taking place. Just the fact that prisoners in Guantanamo are being held indefinitely without charge, to me, is very psychologically abusive and takes a huge toll on the mental state of prisoners in Guantanamo. The other thing that happened when President Obama took place was in one of the 3 executive orders that he signed on the second day of his presidency was an ordered review of treatment of prisoners in Guantanamo. And that review was conducted by the Department of Defense and people in the military. That report showed that, or came back, when that report came back, there were, from what I read in the media, 19 new allegations of abuse that had occurred since Obama had taken place. 13 of those were confirmed with evidence. So there was still some abuse, at least, that had occurred. I don't know what kind of abuse or what, but that did occur to prisoners. That abuse meaning unacceptable to the way guards or interrogators handle prisoners in Guantanamo. There was also media reports about prisoners who said immediately following the election of Barack Obama, there was a spike in abuse by guards. And some of the prisoners said that they felt that it was when Obama got elected and promised to close Guantanamo, personnel in Guantanamo believed that the prison camp would be closed rather quickly, and this was their opportunity to get their last kicks or last licks in on the prisoners. This is something prisoners have expressed to the attorneys. Another question on this side?
In your horrible frustration in 76 days, you said this attorney showed up. How who was fighting for you when you were stripped of all of your rights?
Who was fighting for me? When I was eventually allowed to get mail, I didn't have much, but there was one postcard from some individual in, I believe in Philadelphia or somewhere in Pennsylvania, who did write and said said that Amnesty International and the ACLU is working to get you released. But to what extent, I don't know if any formal moves were made. When I was in prison, most people wouldn't get close to my case until I was actually out of prison and then the charges dropped. Locally in the Seattle, Washington area, there was a chapter of the Council on American and Islamic Relations, which is the Muslim American Civil Rights Organization. The local chapter was very supportive, and they helped my wife and family, and they immediately began raising funds for my legal defense. There was also support from some very activist-type Chinese American groups in the Bay Area, which also started raising public awareness about how I was arrested and made the similarities of my case to that of Dr. Wen-Ho Lee. That happened in, I believe, 94. Chinese-American government scientists who had been accused of espionage. Right? The only support I received really was first from a military attorney who was assigned to me. And when he was assigned to me, he came out very bluntly and sincerely said, look, you need to consider retaining a civilian attorney. And he said, not that I'm not qualified. And he was the head of trial defense for the installation of Fort Stewart in Georgia. But he said that the cards were stacked against us. And he actually recommended a mentor of his who encouraged him to be a military attorney, who was a one-star general in the US Army Reserves, but he was an attorney, practicing a military law attorney in his civilian practice. And he thought perhaps he might be someone who could help level the playing field. Well, it turned out that that individual was not available to lend me any legal counsel. But in the meantime, when I first was able to speak to my father on the phone from the prison cell, I would ask him to do this particular task. I told my father, contact one of my friends from West Point. She was a classmate of mine who had later gone on to law school. And ask her simply for a recommendation who could help me, and that person must be an expert in military law. I figured, being a West Point graduate, having graduated from law school, she would know someone in that field. The other thing I asked of my dad was to contact one of my best friends from high school, who I knew that had gone and become the chief personnel officer for American Express Corporate, New York City. So he had a very high-level corporate position and figured just at that corporate status, he might know someone in the arena. Make sure this guy knows that I need an expert in military law. Neither of these two friends of mine know each other. But when they both got back to my father, they both had the same name recommended to my father. And his name was Mr. Eugene Fidel, F-I-D-E-L-L. And he is the president of the National Institute of Military Justice in Washington, D.C., the individual I said who I would later find is very well connected, very media savvy. And my military attorney would get the information from my father after my father had talked to Gene Fidel and arranged for him to come visit me at the brig, and I would retain him on that particular day. Another question?
Did you meet any good people in the prison?
In
the prison? When you were in prison for 76
prison? Oh, in the prison I was held.
Did you meet a good person?
Did I meet a good person? Yes, there were a handful of good people. The prison that I was held in, the Consolidated Naval Brig, is a Navy prison, Navy brig, but actually the guard force is mixed. There were Navy guards, there were Air Force guards, and there were Marine guards. You might take a guess who were the worst or harshest. The Marine guards. Even the female Marines that were in that, guards at that prison were harsh. They were in terms of their mannerism and treatment. One of the Air Force guards was very cordial to me, and he said, in the very beginning of my imprisonment when I was at the brig there, it was often the case where I didn't get a shower, where I was in that cell for 24 hours a day. But he was someone who said, look, whenever I'm on duty, you'll know that you'll get your shower, something like that. But all in all, the guards in general were following the directives that they were given by their command. And none of my attorneys could actually figure out who was giving the directives, whether it was the command at Guantanamo, even though I was being held in Charleston, South Carolina, or the warden or the commander of the prison. When my attorney approached the prison command, they said, no, we're getting these orders from Guantanamo. And when we they went to Guantanamo, the command said, no, they're following the rules. So, but I was being held under extraordinary conditions. There was a prison handbook in the cell that I was mandated to read and take an orientation test on within the first few days of my arrival to this prison. You know, I scored over 90% on this prison handbook orientation test. But none of what was in this book applied to me. It would tell me how I had to arrange my locker and clothing and stuff in my cell, but none of that was in my cell. It indicated what hours I was allowed to watch television, have privileges, listen to my Walkman. None of these things were allowed to me. So it was really crazy. We couldn't understand why I was being held under such stricter conditions that no other prisoner was being subjected to. Who hasn't asked the question on this side?
Right here.
On this side first.
The question I have is, one of the things you alluded to this morning is disappearing within the United States. And that's a problem for the folks at Guantanamo too. They have no ability to contact the outside world to get the help to earn release. And has that changed at all? Have you seen, I guess, a willingness by the U.S. government to at least allow people to contact their family to have
very little. There are certain exceptions that I've seen where it was allowed. There was one exception that was made when I was there, and it was quite interesting. There was a very elderly type prisoner there, and he was actually getting a surgery done in the hospital. They were going to do some type of I don't know what the surgery is called when they stick the tube in and the little rotator cleans out the arteries. So in layman's term, they call it the roto-rooter thing. But I forget what that's, angioplasty, right? So one of the prisoners was getting that done in Guantanamo at the base hospital, not in the detainee hospital. And they actually allowed him to call his family in, I believe it was Yemen. And it was really interesting watching those who were monitoring his call. Like, well, what was he going to say? I mean, they asked him where he was, and the prisoner himself was like, he looked at the military person like, can I tell them like where I am? And they allowed him. They said I'm in Guantanamo, and he was going to have this surgery. But that particular surgery, I don't know if it's that particularly threatening or what, but they did allow him to contact his family and before that actual surgical procedure. But other than that, I know there's very few instances. The American Red Cross does try to push the letters written back and forth between prisoners and their families. When I was there, most of the letters that prisoners received from their families were at least 3 months outdated. And they were often held by interrogation as carrot sticks in the interrogation process. So that process is really stifled. Every letter has to be censored by the American military. The translators have to translate every letter, and they screen them and they blacken out. I've read that some letters some lawyers have indicated that some of the letters sent to their clients in Guantanamo, even the words that like "I love you" were blackened out, censored by the U.S. military as a way to really humiliate the prisoners. But no, there's really no open communication between prisoners in Guantanamo and their families. Real quick, another one on this side. You had a question?
I was going to ask a question, but this is just a statement to that. Some of us had an experience from Minnesota in January when we were part of an anti-war protest and we were jailed for 27 hours in Washington, D.C. We were never offered a telephone call. We were never, we were moved from jail to jail. We don't know who was authorizing this. We were there for anti-war demonstration.
You got enough food either, did you?
What's that?
The amount of food you got?
Yeah, they forgot. We never got food. So it does happen here. I mean, it happens it happens in Guantanamo.
When I was arrested, I didn't get a phone call. I requested to contact my family to inform them that I had been taken into custody. They refused. And then I demanded that the prison personnel contact my family and inform them that I was taken into custody, and that didn't happen. Later, when I was released and cleared, there was a Department of Defense investigation opened into my case at the urgence of a few congressmen, 3 of which were on the House Armed Service Committee. One of them was my own, and the 4th, who was from California, Congressman Mike Honda, who was head of the Asian American Congressional Caucus, as well as an urgent push by 2 senators, Senator Levin, who now chairs the Senate Armed Service Committee, and the late Senator Kennedy, who is known to be a civil rights champion. They got the Department of Defense to agree to open an investigation into how I was treated. And one of the things they did find fault was why wasn't my family informed that I had been taken into custody, and why was it that they learned of where I was from the media after seeing it on TV.
And that was really my question, was what did your family think for 10 days? I just can't imagine.
Yeah, I had disappeared, right? Something you should all know, my wife is Palestinian, born in the country of Syria, now a naturalized US citizen. But we had just come actually to the United States in early 2001, when I came back into the military as a chaplain. You know, it was only a year later. My wife had a very limited grasp of the English language. She comes from a country where if the government intelligence services knock at your door, that's a scary thing. You may never be seen again. That's a reality in the country she comes from. When the FBI came, the Defense Intelligence Agency came to our apartment the day after I had been arrested. I mean, she didn't know the day after I had disappeared. The only thing that they would mention to her is that your husband is in trouble. But she didn't know if I was alive or dead or what. They wouldn't give her any information. They just merely wanted information from her. And they would ask her things like, who are my friends, stuff like that. And she told them and thought she could help. But they wouldn't give her any information. And it was a week later when these agents would come back with a formal search warrant, and they would actually raid our apartment and seize my computer, seize books, seize papers, seize things from my apartment. And it was a few days after that she saw the news reports, and she still hadn't known where I was. On this side, someone who hasn't asked the question.
This fellow here's been waiting a long time.
Okay, good. Is there someone who would like to moderate or choose? This kind of question is, don't get angry at me.
Don't choose. My question kind of goes back to, how did they determine who to imprison?
In Guantanamo?
In Guantanamo, specifically. Did they get any success out of their interrogation? And the other thing is, what is a successful interrogation?
Oh, good. Excellent questions. Most of the answers to those questions for me is, I don't know. I mean, how do they determine who goes to Guantanamo? I have no idea about the screening process, because we know, at its peak there were over 700 prisoners in Guantanamo. But yet today there are only 180 that remain. That tells you that at least 500 of them have been released. If they were terrorists, we would not have released them, right? Released without charge, right? So I don't know how prisoners were screened before they were brought to Guantanamo. In terms of interrogation, the other questions you had, did any relevant information come from these prisoners in Guantanamo? In my view, I would say very, very, very little, if any, at best, especially when I was there. I will say publicly that when I was there in 2003, not one prisoner in Guantanamo in any way was directly connected to 9/11. It was not possible, it was not a reality. If our government had captured anyone that was a potential legitimate terrorist suspect or in any way connected to any terrorist attack or 9/11, they were not brought to Guantanamo Bay. They were put in a secret CIA black site, and there are at least 19 of them, who were later taken out of the CIA black sites and transferred to Guantanamo in late 2006 after the Supreme Court had ruled against George Bush, ruling his military commissions or war crimes tribunals that were crafted in his administration were unconstitutional. They needed to be legislated, so when he emptied these CIA black sites and brought these individuals to Guantanamo, he, one, in doing this, admitted that we indeed were operating secret CIA black sites, and two, did it in order to get congressional support who would say, yes, now we have legitimate terrorists at Guantanamo, I'm voting for this bill. And the 2006 Military Commissions Act was then passed into law. That has legislated the military commissions, the war crimes tribunals, that are less of a legal standard than what we find in our federal courts. And these were trials that Obama himself had promised to get rid of when he ran for president. And he actually suspended them the day he took office. The night he took office, he suspended the military commissions process for 180 days. And most of us in the circles who are advocating for the closure of Guantanamo for prisoner rights and in the human rights community believe that that was the end of military commissions at Guantanamo. But President Obama has since resurrected those. He reviewed some of it, made some minor changes, and has reenacted them. And actually now, the process is now going forward. The first trial looks like to be that of Canadian citizen Omar Khadr in a military commission down in Guantanamo.
That's it.
Can we go just a couple more minutes? Okay.
Okay. So one more question. How about choosing a questioner? Someone on this side.
Right here.
We have one more question. You and you.
Hypothetical, you have 15 minutes to go to the White House, and the president says, I will listen to what you say. You have 15 minutes to tell me what you would advocate in terms of American foreign, national, and military policy. What do you tell me?
What do I tell?
Given your experience, you have 15 minutes.
First thing I'm going to indicate to him, and he should already know this, that in 2008, when he promised to close Guantanamo, I supported that position. And I myself ran as a delegate and was elected in my state as a national delegate and attended the Democratic National Convention in Denver and casted a delegate vote so that you, Mr. Obama, Mr. President, would win the nomination over Senator Hillary Clinton.
Is that the most important thing you wanted to know?
No, but I would indicate that I was a delegate, so I'm not just someone, but I actually was fully supportive of his candidacy to the extent that I voted for him as a delegate. I would indicate to him that Guantanamo has severely ruined, tarnished the reputation of the United States, and that Guantanamo has not made America safer. It has actually put our citizens and our soldiers further in harm's way. And it's quite clear that if people in Guantanamo did not dislike or hate America before being put in Guantanamo, they certainly do now. And Guantanamo Bay is a recruiting tool for those of extremist ideologies to bring people to their side in order to perhaps take up violence against the United States or troops deployed to the region. So I first and foremost probably advocate that Guantanamo is not making us safer, it's causing more danger to our nation. What will make us safer? A shift in foreign policy.
To what?
Towards what? Towards respecting the rights of everyone, being, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm biased, but across the board, as the world leader, being fair to everyone, without biases. Our policy pretty much is based on what's only in the interest of the United States. I think we need to have more of a global interest approach. And then, of course, in terms of human rights standards, it has to be lent to everyone. Right behind you.
Has there been any personal retaliation against you for speaking out against these atrocities?
That's a good question.
By who?
Anyone?
By anyone. Right after the my Guantanamo experience and coming back in the United States, and even within the first year after leaving the military, I don't know if this is retaliation, but I certainly experienced a lot of difficulty traveling. For at least a year and a half after being released from the military, I could not get a boarding pass on a domestic flight from a kiosk. I had to get it from the ticket counter, who then could not issue a boarding pass but had to call the floor supervisor, who then had to call a security supervisor who had to make a phone call somewhere until it was approved. I had been taken off flights after already been boarded and sitting on the plane. TSA agents coming and re-inspecting my carry-on luggage in the boarding area, things like that. Today I don't have any problems flying domestically, but anytime I do leave the country, I'm detained when I return back to Immigration and Customs. Actually, before I even get off the plane, there's a Customs immigration official waiting at the door of the plane in the jetway for me. And one time it worked to my advantage where I was escorted immediately through passport control to a special office where I was checked in some computer. I was there merely 3 or 4 minutes. Not a single question asked of me, and then I was allowed to go and make my connecting flight. That was at JFK. But other than that, I'm usually held at least 2 hours and questioned about who I saw, what did I do, what am I doing, who paid for my ticket, where,
Do they
Sometimes they ask me, where did I go to school?
Do they copy your hard drive when you're in custody?
I believe the last trip in which I just recently came back from Malaysia, they did that. They seized my computer. They seized my camera. One of the things I did was I took the 1 gigabyte mega chip for your camera, and I put it in my pocket and let them take the camera. And then they came back and said, "Where's the chip?" They took it and probably copied pictures there. But,
Do we think